Hello there and welcome. This session is designed to help you ease into deep, restful sleep. We'll begin with a simple meditation to calm your body and quiet your mind. Then, as you drift closer to sleep, I'll introduce a gentle bedtime story, just enough to carry you into your dreams. So find a comfortable position, close your eyes, and take a deep breath in and out. Take a slow, deep breath in and exhale gently. One more time, inhale deeply, filling your lungs with fresh, soothing air. And as you exhale, let go of the day, releasing any tension, any thoughts that no longer serve you. With each breath, feel your body becoming lighter, more at ease, sinking into comfort. You're doing great. Next, bring your awareness to the top of your head. Imagine a warm, gentle light resting there, like the soft glow of a bedside lamp. This light begins to spread slowly, easing away any tension in your forehead, softening the space between your eyebrows, relaxing your eyelids, your cheeks, your jaw. There's nothing you need to hold on to. Just let everything soften, loosen, unwind. Feel your shoulders drop slightly as if a weight has been lifted. Your arms become heavy, sinking into deep relaxation. With every breath, this warmth moves lower, your chest rising and falling effortlessly, your stomach soft and calm, your legs and feet completely at rest. The world around you fades into quiet. There is nothing to do, nowhere to be. Just this moment, just rest. Imagine yourself wrapped in a cozy, soft blanket of stillness, safe, warm, and peaceful. Each breath carries you deeper into comfort, deeper into rest, deeper into sleep. And here's tonight's cozy bedtime story. The scent of freshly ground coffee and the faintest hint of cinnamon swirled through the air as I wiped down the counter. Mia and Leo's cat café was, in my opinion, the best place in town. Warm, inviting, and home to at least a dozen cats waiting to be adopted. Every day the café buzzed with life. College students huddled over their laptops, retirees lingered over cups of tea, and families brought their children to giggle at the playful kittens weaving between table legs. It was exactly the kind of place that felt like home. So when Ethan Reynolds started showing up daily, scowling at the world as if he had been personally wronged by the existence of adorable kittens and the smell of espresso, I couldn't help but be a little intrigued. It had started a few weeks ago. He had walked in, tall and brooding, wearing a worn leather jacket that smelled faintly of rain. He had ordered a black coffee, no sugar, no cream, and then grumbled under his breath when Leo, my best friend and co-owner, offered him a complimentary kitten cuddle with his drink. "I'm here to write, not play babysitter to a bunch of fur balls," Ethan had said, dropping into the corner booth and pulling out a battered notebook. That had set the tone for every visit since. Every day, Ethan arrived like clockwork, scowled at the kittens, complained about the noise, and ordered the same thing. It was as if he was punishing himself by coming here, yet he never failed to show up. Leo and I had a silent agreement to keep an eye on him, He was clearly a writer in distress, the kind of writer who had probably once thrived on coffee shop inspiration, but now found himself too tangled in his own mind to make sense of the words. "He's a classic case of writer's block," Leo whispered to me one afternoon as we watched Ethan glare at Biscuit, a particularly mischievous tabby who had taken to perching on his table. "Maybe he just hates cats," I murmured back. "No one hates cats. He's just pretending." I wasn't sure, but I was starting to believe Leo was right, especially after the day Whiskers and Biscuit decided to steal Ethan's notebook. It had started as a typical afternoon. Ethan hunched over his notebook, pen tapping rhythmically against the paper, a frown tugging at the corners of his mouth. I was behind the counter, humming along to the jazz music playing softly through the speakers, when I noticed Whiskers and Biscuit slinking toward his booth. Biscuit jumped onto the table first, as bold as ever, knocking over Ethan's coffee in the process. He cursed, but before he could shoo the kitten away, Whiskers grabbed the notebook between her teeth and leaped off the table. "Hey!" Ethan shot up, his chair scraping against the floor as he lunged after them. Biscuit, always eager to join in on the chaos, took this as an invitation to play. With a delighted chirp, he pounced on the notebook, batting it around like a toy. Pages fluttered and ink smudged as the two kittens turned Ethan's precious notes into their latest amusement. I rushed over, trying and failing to stifle my laughter. "Whiskers, Biscuit, drop it." They did not. If anything, Whiskers doubled down, running in gleeful circles as Ethan chased her around the cafe. Leo, who had been watching from behind the espresso machine, burst out laughing. "I think they've adopted your story, Ethan." "Not funny," Ethan grumbled, but there was no real heat behind his words. He finally managed to scoop up Whiskers, who squirmed for a moment before deciding Ethan made a decent enough perch. She promptly curled up in the crook of his arm, purring. I watched, fascinated, as the tension in Ethan's shoulders melted just a little. He looked down at the kitten with an expression I'd never seen on him before. Soft, almost bewildered. Biscuit, not to be outdone, hopped onto the booth and stared at him expectantly. With a resigned sigh, Ethan scratched behind Biscuit's ears. "Your trouble, you know that?" Biscuit purred louder. Leo nudged me. "Told you, he doesn't hate cats." Ethan didn't even argue. He just sat down, Whiskers still cradled in his arm, and shook his head. "They're absolute menaces." "But cute menaces," I pointed out. He exhaled, rubbing his temple. "Yeah, fine. Cute menaces." That was the moment something shifted. After that, Ethan's visits became less about glaring at the world and more about subtle interactions with the kittens. He still grumbled, of course, but I noticed the way he let Whiskers curl up beside him while he wrote, or how Biscuit would steal his pen, and instead of snapping, Ethan would simply sigh and retrieve it like it was a game they played. And then there was the day he brought treats. I didn't comment on it, just watched as he awkwardly held out a small cat treat to Whiskers, who took it happily before nuzzling against his hand. He muttered something about not making a big deal out of it, but Leo and I exchanged a knowing glance. One evening, when the cafe was quieter than usual, I found Ethan still sitting in his usual booth long after closing time. He was staring down at his notebook, the pages filled with fresh ink. I brought over a cup of tea instead of coffee and slid into the seat across from him. "Good writing day?" He looked up, almost startled, then down at Whiskers, who was dozing on his lap. Yeah, actually. He hesitated, then let out a breath. I haven't had one of those in a long time. I smiled. Glad to hear it. He glanced around the cafe, then shook his head. This place is ridiculous. The kittens, the people. The fact that you guys somehow convinced me to willingly interact with them. I tilted my head. And yet, here you are. He huffed a laugh. Yeah, here I am. It wasn't an admission, not exactly, but it didn't need to be. Because I saw the way he absent-mindedly stroked Whiskers' fur, the way his scowl had softened over the weeks, the way his notebook was no longer blank. Ethan Reynolds, best-selling author with an infamous case of writer's block, had found a cure, and it had whiskers and a purr. I had never seen Ethan so frustrated before. He wasn't just stuck. He was stranded in the middle of a creative desert, parched for inspiration. His usual fire, the spark that lit up his eyes when a new idea took hold, had dulled into something weary and tired. Leo and I weren't about to let him wither away in his creative drought. Not if we could help it. Our first attempts were subtle. At the cafe where Ethan always worked, we strategically placed books with timeless love stories near his favorite table. We made sure the playlist had just enough romance to seep into his subconscious, soulful melodies about longing, connection, and fate. Leo even introduced him to a few quirky regulars, the kind of characters who practically wrote themselves into stories. But nothing worked. He'd stare at his screen, rub his temples, and sigh heavily. Then one evening, just as I was about to wave the white flag of surrender, I noticed something, rather, someone. Sophie, the charming librarian with a quiet grace and an infectious laugh, had just walked in. Ethan's fingers, which had been frozen over his keyboard, suddenly twitched. His eyes followed her without meaning to, his lips pressing together like he was fighting an involuntary smile. Leo caught my eye. I grinned. Maybe Ethan didn't just need inspiration. Maybe he needed love. From that moment on, our mission changed. Leo and I became matchmakers. Not the obvious kind, no. We weren't about to throw them into some cliché rom-com scenario where they accidentally bumped into each other and spilled coffee all over their clothes. No, we were much more sophisticated than that. First, we made sure Sophie had every reason to linger in the cafe. I started asking her about book recommendations whenever she passed by, striking up conversations that kept her near Ethan's table just long enough for him to overhear. Leo subtly encouraged her to try the cafe's special drinks, conveniently bringing them out right when Ethan happened to be looking up. Next, we nudged Ethan in her direction. One afternoon, I accidentally left a copy of one of Sophie's favorite books on his table. When he picked it up and flipped through it, Sophie's voice floated over. "Oh, you're reading that?" Ethan looked up, startled, his usual guarded expression softening. Yeah, it was just here." She smiled, pushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "It's one of my favorites. If you like it, I can recommend others." I held my breath. Ethan hesitated, but then, finally, he nodded. "Yeah, I'd like that. Progress." Leo and I high-fived under the counter. Over the next few weeks, the connection between Ethan and Sophie grew in small, unspoken ways. He started sitting closer to the shelves where she often browsed, pretending not to notice when she glanced his way. she began showing up just as he was ordering, coincidentally picking the same table nearby. Their conversations, at first hesitant, became longer, warmer. One evening, Ethan stayed late at the cafe, fingers dancing over his keyboard in a way they hadn't in months. I snuck a peek at his screen. A love story. Leo and I didn't say a word. We just watched as inspiration, no, something even better, began to take hold of him again. Ethan was writing, and maybe, just maybe, falling in love. The storm had settled into a gentle drizzle by the time Ethan and Sophie left the cafe together. I watched them from my corner seat, barely containing a triumphant grin as Leo nudged me under the table. "It worked," he whispered, his voice smug. I nodded, watching as Ethan held his coat over Sophie's head, guiding her through the wet streets. They were talking, actually talking, and for once Ethan didn't look like he wanted to escape. I let out a slow breath. Progress. Leo leaned back, stretching his arms. "Told you. A few well-placed coincidences, and even the most stubborn hearts can bend." I rolled my eyes. It wasn't just the coincidences, Leo. It was persistence, and a little bit of feline intervention. As if summoned, Whiskers hopped onto our table, his tail flicking my teacup dangerously close to the edge. Biscuit, not to be outdone, decided to pounce onto Leo's lap, sending his half-eaten croissant to the floor. Leo groaned, scooping up the squirming cat. "You're lucky you're cute, Biscuit." I rubbed Whiskers behind the ears, my mind drifting back to Ethan and Sophie. I'd spent weeks observing them, testing ways to bring them into each other's orbit without them realizing. At first, Ethan had resisted. He kept to himself, scribbling away in his leather-bound notebook, barely sparing a glance at Sophie, no matter how many times she ended up in his vicinity. Sophie, on the other hand, had always been warm, always willing to engage, even when Ethan responded with little more than grunts and polite nods. Then came the pastry incident, a casual slip of information. Sophie's love for almond croissants had led to a carefully orchestrated placement of the treat beside Ethan's usual black coffee. He'd barely noticed the first time, but by the third, his curiosity got the better of him. "Is someone messing with the pastry display?" he'd asked one day, squinting at the counter as if the baked goods had conspired against him. Sophie, conveniently standing next to him, had laughed. "Or maybe the universe is telling you to expand your horizons." He'd given her a skeptical glance, but then, to my utter delight, he had ordered one. Small moments like that had built up over time. Sophie borrowing books from the cafe's reading shelf and conveniently choosing the ones Ethan had previously read. Whiskers knocking over Sophie's tea, forcing Ethan to hand her a napkin and engage in an awkward, adorable exchange. Biscuit escaping onto Ethan's table, rubbing against his hand until he reluctantly scratched behind her ears, unknowingly softening in Sophie's presence. And now, here we were. Ethan was walking Sophie home, voluntarily. Leo must have sensed my excitement because he chuckled, tossing a sugar packet at me. "You should play matchmaker professionally. You've got a talent for it." I scoffed, catching the packet. "Please, this was a one-time thing. Besides, Ethan is impossible." "Difficult," I corrected. "But not impossible. He just needed a push. And Sophie? Well, she was always ready to catch him." Outside, the rain had picked up again, the streetlights casting a golden glow over the glistening pavement. I watched as Sophie laughed at something Ethan said, her hand briefly touching his arm. He didn't pull away. Instead, he tilted his head, his expression softening in a way I'd never seen before. I exhaled, feeling something warm settle in my chest. Maybe love really was just a series of well-placed coincidences and a couple of meddling cats. I knew Ethan was prone to overthinking, but this was another level. Just when things were finally looking up, his novel was coming together. Sophie was softening him in ways none of us thought possible. He had to go and Ethan it all up. Classic. First, he started pulling away from Sophie. I saw it happening in slow motion, like a scene in one of those black and white films he secretly loved but would never admit to watching. He answered her texts later and later, his responses turning from thoughtful to one-word replies. Then came the inevitable excuses. Too much work, too tired, too something. Sophie, being the stubborn optimist she was, tried to reach him. But you can't talk sense into someone who's already convinced they don't deserve happiness. Then the manuscript went missing. I was the one who found the first page, wedged under the couch, thanks to the crime syndicate of sneaky paws in my apartment. Leo had been cat-sitting for Ethan while he sulked, and, apparently, Ethan's pages made for excellent toys. It took a bit of searching, under the fridge, in a shoebox, crumpled up in a plant pot, but we pieced together most of his novel, and that's when we saw it. Ethan's book wasn't just about some fictional, grumpy author. It was about him falling for Sophie. Only, in the story, the protagonist actually let himself have a happy ending. That settled it. If Ethan wouldn't fight for his own story, we would. This is either the most brilliant idea we've ever had or the dumbest thing we've ever done, Leo said, squinting at the banner Sophie was hanging up outside the cafe. It's definitely somewhere in between, I admitted, stepping back to admire our handiwork. The cafe was decked out exactly as Ethan had described in his book, down to the mismatched chairs and the small wooden shelf stuffed with old novels. Even the sign above the door now read, "The Grumpy Author's Cat Café," just as he had written it. We'd roped in nearly half the town to help pull this off. Sophie's idea, of course. If Ethan wanted to push people away, we'd make it impossible for him to ignore that he was loved. Sophie stood in the middle of the cafe, nervously adjusting the chalkboard sign. Today's special, a plot twist for Ethan. What if he hates it? Then he can deal with it, Leo said. But I don't think he will. I didn't either. The moment Ethan saw this, he'd have no choice but to acknowledge the truth, that love, like a great story, isn't about control. It's about taking risks. And sometimes, it's about letting a few sneaky kittens steal your manuscript so your friends can remind you of what really matters. Now all we had to do was get Ethan through the door. The cafe hums with warmth, the scent of cinnamon and fresh coffee blending with the murmur of voices and soft laughter. Fairy lights twinkle from the rafters, casting a golden glow over the bustling room. My heart pounds as I watch Ethan push through the door, his eyes widening at the sight before him. Every single person in town has gathered here, each holding a page of his story. Some pages are creased, some smudged with fingerprints, signs of love, of words read and reread. Leo nudges my elbow, grinning. He didn't see this coming. No, he didn't. None of us did. When Ethan left months ago, lost in his own doubts, I feared he wouldn't return. But here he is, standing at the threshold, his expression a mix of shock and something deeper, something tender. His gaze sweeps over the crowd, landing on Sophie. She's standing by the counter, her apron dusted with flour, a smudge of icing on her wrist. She's the picture of comfort and home, and for the first time I see the realization settle in his eyes. This is his place. This is his story. Silence hangs between them for a moment, and then he steps forward. Sophie. His voice is raw, unguarded. He stops, looking down at the page in her hands. Then, taking a shaky breath, he lifts his eyes to hers. I love you. The words ripple through the cafe, soft gasps and smiles blooming around us. My chest tightens, my throat thick with emotion. Sophie, ever so steady, blinks once, twice, and then she smiles. A slow, radiant thing that lights up the entire room. You took your time, she teases, but her voice is thick, her fingers gripping the page like it's the only thing tethering her to the moment. Ethan lets out a breathless laugh. I got lost in the plot. She steps forward, closing the space between them. Well, let's start a new chapter together then. When he kisses her, the cafe erupts into cheers. Leo whoops beside me, and I find myself grinning, blinking against the happy sting in my eyes. Even Whiskers and Biscuit, ever the watchful matchmakers, curl up contentedly in Ethan's lap as he finally takes a seat. As the night unfolds, the cafe remains alive with joy, with laughter. New kittens scamper around, weaving between ankles, finding their forever homes. Sophie and Ethan steal glances, their hands brushing as they move around each other like they've always belonged in the same space. And me? I sit back and watch, the warmth of it all settling deep in my bones. This place, this cafe, it's more than just a setting in a story. It's a home. And for Ethan, for Sophie, for all of us, it's just the beginning.